Gaza War Day 179, and an alleged Israeli airstrike in Gaza killed 7 foreign aid workers after a food delivery. The source of the fire could not be independently confirmed. The IDF says it's probing what it termed a tragic incident, and the U.S. is urging a swift investigation. More from ILTV's Steve Leibovitz.
Citizens from Australia, Britain, Poland, and dual citizens from the U.S. and Canada were among the 7 aid workers with the World Central Kitchen charity who were killed in a strike on their vehicle in central Gaza last night. There were immediate demands for accountability.
We certainly have already contacted the Israeli government directly. We are contacting the Israeli ambassador to ask for accountability here. The truth is that this is beyond any reasonable circumstances. Someone going about providing aid and humanitarian assistance should lose their life.
In its initial response, the IDF did not say whether it was responsible for the strike, but stated that it was carrying out in-depth examination at the highest levels to understand the circumstances of the tragic incident. The group helped deliver food and other supplies to northern Gaza that had arrived hours earlier by ship, officials in Gaza said. Even before an investigation, World Central Kitchen announced that it lost several of its brothers and sisters in an IDF airstrike in Gaza. Its founder, Chef Jose Andres, posted on social media site X and announced that his group had suspended its operations.
I just spoke to WCK founder, Chef Jose Andres, and expressed the deepest condolences of Israel Defense Forces to the families and the entire World Central Kitchen family. We have been reviewing the incident in the highest levels to understand the circumstances of what happened and how it happened. We will be opening a probe to examine this serious incident further. This will help us reduce the risk of such an event from occurring again.
Meanwhile, an Israeli government spokesman summed up the 2-week military operation inside Shifa Hospital, saying it was an important victory over Hamas.
The Prime Minister confirmed, and I quote, "Our forces operated there in an exemplary fashion. Shifa has become a main terrorism command center for Hamas. The surprise action by our forces was precise and surgical."
And now Israel is not only fighting a war on the battlefield in Gaza and in the north against Hezbollah, it's also fighting a war against anti-Semitism and a war for global public opinion. This secondary war is no less critical as today we're seeing the growing tides of anti-Semitism in the West, reminiscent of the darkest times in Jewish history. And so joining us in the studio now to discuss all this and more is Stephan Thompson, the founder of Visegrad 24, one of the largest, if not the largest, news platforms in Central and Eastern Europe. Stephan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So first, let's start with the reason why you're here in Israel. Just this week, you were honored by Amichai Shikli, the Minister of Diaspora Affairs and Combating Anti-Semitism, for your extraordinary role and actions to combat anti-Semitism since October 7th. You've been countering misinformation online about Israel, about this war, and I'm curious, what led you to take on this role?
That's a very wide question. It's an excellent question. Visegrad is a project that I've been building over the last several years. Initially, it was focused on Central and Eastern Europe, and it was exclusively Central and Eastern European. We realized that the battle that we were facing was not only with the radical elements within our own societies who are sort of working against the order that we have built from within. The West has been built, and we have the enemies within the gates. We have radical progressives who are pushing back against the very values that have turned the West into the greatest civilization of all time. This is the best time to be alive in the history of the world. And the forces that we are fighting, aside from the radical progressives within our own societies, is this combined axis of Iran, China, Russia, Qatar, and their various acolytes. The war that is happening here, it's not a land war, it's not a war about Israel even in many ways. Of course it is to the people who are living here and to the people whose families are hostages. And of course there is a land war with Hamas, but it's part of a much broader conflict. It's an intrinsic part of a battle for Western civilization. That is why I'm here. The award from Minister Shikli, the work that I've done, it's not even combating anti-Semitism as much as it is combating anti-Western sentiment. And that is very much the fight that I'm involved in, and I'm very proud to fight alongside a great number of incredible people here in Israel.
You know, you mentioned the fight against not only Israel, but against the West and Western culture.
Sure.
You know, how do you see Israel's efforts to win this war against anti-Semitism, and against Gaza, against, you know, these elements of extremist Islamist ideology, you know, and the war over public opinion as well in Europe? Because, you know, looking at the capitals of the West today,
Sure.
you see more anti-Israel, anti-West hate than you see in some Arab countries. I mean, how do you explain this?
The land war will be won without a doubt. The war for public opinion is a very difficult one because the enemy that we face is more numerous in terms of absolute numbers. I think that the issue that we're seeing is that Israel and the West brings facts to the table. It turns out that their feelings do not care about our facts, and that they have superseded all of our facts. They're completely disregarded. What we're seeing in Western capitals, especially places where I grew up that I feel very strongly about, I grew up in London, seeing 300,000 people on Remembrance Sunday marching with Palestinian flags, chanting from the river to the sea, or Yemen, Yemen, make us proud, is absolutely staggering, shocking, worrying. But I believe that as we see this increased presence on the streets, there is a silent majority that is regrettably silent, but that is terrified of what is happening. And I believe that, and I believe we will see some form of correction. But I don't think there is much that can be done because of how numerous the enemy is and how well organized the disinformation efforts against us are. The only thing that can be done, and this is what I try to do on a micro level, is to create as good content as possible in order to counter this wave of fake news and misinformation.
And we really are seeing sort of a targeted campaign of misinformation online.
Absolutely. There is no doubt about it, and there is a long-term strategy. The preparations for what has been happening now, this is not Hamas's PR operations. This truly is a combined effort of several nefarious states that have combined forces that have very powerful tools, from the Qataris using Al Jazeera, to the Russians using Russian Today, to bot farms around from Algino, to TikTok promoting purposefully pro-Hamas propaganda. And we've seen this on our own accounts. We have a fairly large TikTok account where, since the coverage that we have conducted of the Israel-Hamas war, our videos have gone from, on average, several 100,000 views to not crossing 1,000 views on TikTok. This is a concerted effort where we're fighting algorithms, we're fighting genuine online users, and we're fighting states that have long-term strategies that are not just anti-Semitic, but that are fundamentally anti-Western. And I do think that much of this conflict is, as much as I understand Israelis who think of it in terms of just anti-Semitism, I do very strongly feel that this is a much broader war, that this is a war we are in together. Obviously, you are at the front line. It is Israelis dying today, but if we do not win this war, if we do not stop the enemy at the gates, this conflict will keep going.
And, you know, hearing you speak, I have to ask: are you concerned for the future of Europe, for the future of the West?
I am concerned for the future of the West. I am concerned that the values that have built it have been disappearing, and I have a very deep fear that there is a lack of understanding in Western society that order is incredibly fragile and that life is very fragile. This is something that the Jews, the Jewish diaspora, the Israelis profoundly understand because of generational trauma, of a very difficult history where life is incredibly uncertain. The last 70 years since the victory in World War II have been the victory of the West has been complete. The level of comfort has been extraordinary, of economic comfort, physical comfort. There's no real challenges facing the Western world, which means that suddenly we have forgotten that all the things that have been built at a great cost it's a tremendous cost of generations of people who've put work into building what we have, the freedoms that we have, the luxuries that we have, the economic freedoms and the economic potential and the ability to create wealth and social mobility and all these things that have made the West great. There is a lack of understanding that there was a fight to build all of that and that it can all go. So yes, I'm deeply, deeply concerned. But I'm a religious person, so I have to be optimistic. I have a great deal of hope that we will emerge victorious in one way or another, And there is an optimism in me. I think there are many people who are waking up and who are willing to fight for the West, and there is a joy from the willingness to fight.
Well, Stephan, continue doing the incredible work that you and your team are doing.
Thank you
so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Experience the power of truth with ILTV News. If you're looking for quality content and captivating visuals, join our news community and become an integral part of our team as we embark on a mission to unveil the real Israel, dismantling the web of lies and misinformation that surround reporting on Israel. By subscribing to ILTV News, you will not only have access to the latest updates, but you will also amplify our message, creating a ripple effect that carries the truth far and wide. Subscribe today and help reshape the narrative. Available on the web, Android, and Apple. And moving on, Iran is warning of a harsh response after a top Iranian Revolutionary Guard commander was killed in an alleged Israeli airstrike on Damascus. ILTV's Steve Leibovitz has the latest.
The Israeli Air Force allegedly carried out the bold airstrike on a building next to Iran's embassy in the Syrian capital. The blast killed at least 6 people, including top Iranian commander Mohammad Reza Zahedi. Zahedi was the Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force commander, responsible for the unit's operations in Syria and Lebanon, and was the most senior commander of Iranian forces in those countries. Israel has yet to comment or take responsibility for the attack. Iran is warning of a harsh response.
عرض کردم که رژیم میدونه که این نوع اقدامات هیچ موقع بی پاسخ نمونده و قطعا نخواهد.
Israel does not, as a rule, comment on specific strikes in Syria, but has admitted to conducting hundreds of sorties against Iran-backed terror groups attempting to gain a foothold in the country over the last decade. Faced with ongoing attacks by Hezbollah and Shiite militias throughout the Middle East, Israel has escalated its strikes on Iran-linked targets in Syria, killing numerous Revolutionary Guard operatives.
And top U.S. and Israeli officials held virtual talks on the planned Israeli military operation in Rafah. The U.S. says Israel agreed to take its concerns into account, and there will be a follow-up next week in Washington. More on this from ILTV's Devo Klein.
A virtual meeting was held between top U.S. and Israeli officials to discuss the potential Rafah operation. This after Prime Minister Netanyahu canceled the initial meeting in protest of the U.S. failure to veto a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza.
I can confirm that there is a virtual meeting happening today with both U.S. Israeli officials to discuss Rafah, the situation in Rafah, and obviously the next steps that we have been hearing that the Israeli government wants to take. This is following the discussions that we all talked about last week with the Israeli Minister of Defense and his delegation.
The U.S. says that Israel agreed to take into account U.S. concerns regarding a massive Rafah invasion and also agreed to hold follow-up conversations on the matter next week in Washington. According to the U.S. readout, the sides agreed that they shared the objective of seeing Hamas defeated in Rafah. The meeting was led on the Israeli side by Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer, along with National Security Council Chair Tzachi Hanegbi. Israel has argued that an operation in Rafah is essential, as it cannot win the war without dismantling Hamas's remaining battalions. The U.S. maintains that a large operation will not advance Israel's war aims because it will lead to even more civilian casualties, further isolating Israel internationally and harming Israel's long-term security. In a related development, a new weapons deal between Israel and the U.S. is reportedly under consideration. 50 F-15 fighter jets, advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, and other precision-guided weapons are being considered.
And the Israeli Knesset has passed a new law that will allow the government to temporarily shut down foreign news agencies operating in Israel that are posing real harm to its national security. The target, the Qatari-owned Al Jazeera network. All the details in the following report.
אני קובע כי הצעת חוק מניעת פגיעת גוף שידורים זר בביטחון המדינה הוראת שעה חרבות ברזל התשפ"ד 2024 התקבלה בקריאה שנייה ושלישית ותיכנס לספר החוקים.
The Knesset on Monday evening passed into law a bill dubbed the Al Jazeera Law that grants the government the authority to temporarily shut down foreign news agencies operating in Israel if they are deemed to cause real harm to national security. The vote passed 71-10 in its second and third final readings in the plenum. Following the vote, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is recovering from surgery, said in a statement on X that he would take immediate action to stop the Qatari-based channel's activity in Israel. He said that, quote, Al Jazeera harmed Israel's security, actively participated in the October 7th massacre, and incited against Israeli soldiers. He added it was time to remove the horn of Hamas from our country. Communications Minister Shlomo Karhi led the effort to pass the law and said Al Jazeera would be shut down in the coming days. The new law allows for the communications minister to shut down the station for 45 days, after which the request needs to be reapproved. The decision also needs to undergo judicial review, and it is important to note that the law was passed as a temporary law that expires July 31st. The Israeli government had expressed concern over Al Jazeera in the past, but stopped short of taking any measures which might upset Qatar due to its role in the hostage negotiations. And joining us now with more on the Al Jazeera Law is the Executive Director of Honest Reporting, Gil Hoffman. Gil, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure being with you, Lidar.
So the Knesset passed the new law. Its target, and they've said this openly, is Qatari-owned Al Jazeera station, which has been deemed to be harming Israel's national security. What more can you tell us about this new law and the government's intentions?
Well, first of all, I need to admit that I've been interviewed on Al Jazeera many times, and at times when the government has decided to boycott Al Jazeera and not send any official government spokesman, sometimes I've come there and presented the Israeli point of view. That being said, now they're taking a step beyond that and trying to make it illegal for Al Jazeera to operate in Israel. And so technically, the bill would allow the prime ministers to sign an edict saying that a particular media outlet could not work here. They would be able to confiscate their broadcasting equipment and close their office. And they would need approval from a judge to be able to do it. It would be only for 45 days, and then it would have to go through a process again. And it can only happen during a war.
And, you know, the United States has expressed concern over the bill. I mean, what's your analysis of this? Is this law really going to hamper freedom of the press in Israel?
This law, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on where you're coming from, will change very, very little. Al Jazeera can broadcast from Ramallah. Al Jazeera can broadcast from Gaza. It won't end up with anyone seeing them less than they do now. It'll make it harder for Israeli officials to talk to Al Jazeera and present the Israeli point of view. But it will send a message that Israel doesn't want Al Jazeera, after all the harm they've done to Israel during this war, to act unhampered. And there have been plenty of very incorrect reports on Al Jazeera that were unprofessional and that did a lot of damage to Israel. So I understand why the government wants to make a symbolic gesture, even if it won't be very effective and even if it will be very temporary.
And are there any other news organizations that might also fall into this category besides Al Jazeera?
So there are Hezbollah and Hamas-affiliated television stations. They don't have offices here, though they do operate from here in one way or another, and so technically it would apply. But you have to understand, there are laws like this in democracies all around the world. In England, for instance, they removed Press TV of Iran from their cable networks. They haven't gone further in banning them, but there are limitations to enemy media around the world. And if anything, it sends a message. People don't realize that Al Jazeera is Qatari state-run media. People watching this in America and Canada and England, they might have a problem with getting state-run media of Russia or of China, but they watch Al Jazeera. They need to know that Al Jazeera is the state media of Qatar, and broadcast the opinion of Qatar, which is not only against Israel and against the Jews in general, but also against the Palestinian Authority and moderates among the Palestinians. They want Hamas to take over the West Bank and Gaza, and they want to aid and abet the terrorism that they fund.
You know, this has been something that's been discussed for a long time, since Israel's security forces warned that Al Jazeera was disclosing the location of Israeli troops in Gaza, but the government has refrained from taking action due to the hostage negotiations, which are still ongoing. So this begs the question, why now? You know, why pass this law now?
Lidar, I think you're hitting the nail on the head that this has to do with the hostage negotiations, that they are purposely trying to pressure Qatar, the state sponsor of Hamas, during the hostage negotiations in order to get Hamas to give in to them. And maybe if a deal is reached to bring the hostages home at a less exorbitant price than the Hamas has been demanding, maybe suddenly this law will be suspended. Maybe this has to do with we thought that Israel wouldn't take as much action in Gaza during Ramadan and then went into Shifa in order to prove the strength of the IDF and make it encourage the Hamas to give in during the negotiations. Maybe this is the same intent.
All right, well, Gil Hoffman, thank you so much for your analysis today.
Pleasure being with you, Nita.
And now, it's nearly 6 months into this war. The IDF is still engaging Hamas terrorists in Gaza and Hezbollah terrorists in Lebanon. And there are still 134 hostages being held in captivity in Gaza. Joining me now to take a moment to reflect on this in the studio is ILTV's host of Insider, Steve Leibovitz. Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
And it's always my pleasure, Lidar.
So it's been 6 months, nearly 6 months.
Just about, a few more days.
War.
Yep.
You're taking an in-depth look on this week's Insider. What can you tell us?
Well, we have David Hurwitz from the Times of Israel. We also have Alon Tal, former Knesset member, who's going to be joining us from California, where he's speaking on campuses and so on. Look, we're in a very difficult situation right now. The war isn't being fought in Rafah yet. There are stories all the time, as we had today, about things that go on in Gaza, like the tragedy of the 7 foreign aid workers that were killed today. We're going to discuss all of it. And there were protests in the streets. There are demands for the prime minister to go to elections and to be replaced. So I'm going to talk about that feeling of unity that we had on October 7th and whether it exists until today.
The feeling of unity, that's a very interesting topic to be discussed. So don't miss ILTV's Insider, airing tonight after the news. Steve, thank you so much for coming
Pleasure.
on. And now, let's take a look at the weather forecast. Mostly clear skies are expected tonight around the country, with temperatures reaching lows of 16 degrees Celsius or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Then tomorrow, partly cloudy skies and rising temperatures expected to reach highs of around 29 degrees Celsius or 84 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's all for today's news. For more updates from Israel on all your devices, check out our ILTV channel, subscribe to our ILTV newsletter, and don't forget to check out our new and improved website, ILTV.tv, with all the latest news from the heart of the State of Israel. I'm Lidar Gravelazi. Be well, stay safe, and thank you so much for watching.